INCRadio, DCEM 954, the voice of truth, the official radio station of the Church of Christ or Iglesia ni Cristo.
And good morning, everyone, and welcome to INC Radio Florida. This is I'm one of your hosts, Brother Robert Topalis, coming to you from here in Tampa, Florida. Here today, of course, is Saturday, the 1st of March. I can't believe how fast this year has been flying. It's about 9:30 in the afternoon, or 9:30 in the afternoon. It shows you how fast the year's been flying. It's 9:30 in the morning here on the East Coast of the United States, which means that it's a little past 10:30 there in the Philippines. For our viewers, thank you for staying up late to watch us again. But we're really, really excited this morning to get together and talk to you about a subject that I think is going to help a lot of couples navigate some of those difficult decisions that they've probably been struggling with. And we're going to be talking about how it is that you can understand better how to compromise. But before we do that, I wanted to toss it over to Sister Joy there in Orlando to greet our international audience. Good morning, Sister Joy. How are you doing?
Good morning, Brother Robert. Thank you for that. And you know what? International indeed, because we are across the globe. So I'm going to try this. Okay.
Ready for you.
Good morning. Are you guys ready for it? Okay. Good morning. Bonjour. Guten Morgen. Buenos dias. And magandang umaga. Magandang gabi. There to all of those that are listening in the Philippines. Thank you for joining us. We're excited to hear from you all. So please make sure that you say hello and let us know where you're from, especially in our YouTube chat.
Absolutely. That was beautifully done. I couldn't have done it better myself. In fact,
I'm glad you're not my
way I could have done it better myself.
Well, thank you.
And then we've also got joining us this morning, Sister Charisse. How are things there, Sister Charisse in Pensacola?
Good morning, everyone. Sister Charisse here in Pensacola. It is beautiful today. Very excited. It's supposed to be beautiful weather, nice and sunny. Nothing too cold, but always ideal to layer up, like Sister Audrey always teaches us. So yes, it's beautiful weather today, and I'm excited to be here with everyone. I've missed all of you, and I'm so excited for today's topic as well. I think it's going to be very, very informative for anyone who, marriage wise, or who just wants to seek some future advice, just little tips and tricks for, when they're planning for the days ahead. So it's always good. We're very excited for our episode today. So
yeah, absolutely. And it's funny because in the title, it's called Give and Take, right? And it's kind of the art of compromise. And when you think about it, that's exactly what compromise is. It's an art, because it's not something that you'll just necessarily know without practice. And maybe compromise is something that does take practice. I know that for us, all three of us actually are married at varying different number of years that we've been married. I know for Sister Charisse and Sister Joy, you guys are kind of there in that stage of between 10 and 15 years of marriage, right? How long have you been married, Sister?
19.
19. You're like right on the edge of 20. What about you, Sister Charisse?
Well, me and Brother Eric have been together since 2002, so that's 23 years, and then we've been married since 2007, so that's 18.
So 18 years, 19 years. I've been married for 35 years. And there's just a lot of learning that happens. And, that's what we hope to bring to you in the show today, is bring you some experience and understanding of things that we've gone through, just not personally in our relationships, but more importantly, in relationships that we've observed and things that we've learned over the years on what the important.
And isn't learning? Learning is so learning. And once you've learned something, right, it's like you gotta pivot again and learn another way. So it's fun. It's fun. We're gonna.
Yeah, this is gonna be a fun conversation. And remember, there's no judging. Right. This is
absolutely safe space.
This is a safe zone for all of us, because this is about learning, and that's really what the goal is. So, when we talk about the art of compromise, one of the things that first comes up all the time is, well, what are the things, or what are the areas that typically are the most common areas of compromise? Because you're thinking, well, is marriage all about compromising everything? Well, there's always going to be some compromise. There's going to be things that you already kind of meet in the middle ground for. And when you talk about compromise, here are some of the most common areas that husbands and wives typically have to compromise on. And so the first one, of course, makes absolute sense, right? Daily life decisions like who's doing the dishes, who does the cooking, schedules, responsibilities, especially when you have children, right? Sister Cherise and Sister Joy, you guys both have children,
Absolutely.
and I'm sure there's a lot of scheduling involved, right, for you guys?
Still trying to figure this one out sometimes,
Well,
Very much so.
right?
so, like when we talk about household chores, I mean, one of the most common is, cleaning, of course, making the bed, doing laundry, and things like that. When we first got married, Sister Lulu had the perfect plan. She trained me how to do laundry the day after we were married, and hasn't had to do it since for me.
Wow.
So, yes, I do my own laundry. But when it comes to things like cooking and cleaning, or cooking and then like putting away the dishes, for example, that's one of the big areas where if one person does the cooking, then there's the decision about, well, then if you do the cooking, are you also supposed to be the one doing the dishes? And should you also be the one cleaning up after things? Or is it a split between, the one that did the cooking and then the one that's going to have to clean the dishes and put them away? It's those types of things that are compromised. And we're not going to answer it yet. We're going to kind of go over how we decide who does what. The next is finances, budgeting. It makes a lot of sense because budgeting and spending, especially when you're married, that's one of the most common areas where conflict occurs is around finances, right? So that's another common area of compromise for couples as well. Parenting styles. When you start having children, you also are going to have to come to the decision about how it is you want to raise them. And some advice before we even get into the conversation is you probably want to figure that out before you have the kids.
Is that a warning? Or
Is that right? Is that right? Because trying to figure it out when the kids are already misbehaving or if you're trying to correct them, so you want to figure out your parenting styles before the kids actually arrive. Maybe, and then the next is, especially when you do have kids, and even when you don't have kids, when you're still newlyweds, is personal time versus couple time, right? You're single, you're used to kind of doing things on your own. There's no real schedule you're following. You kind of just go with the flow, so to speak, right? But now as a couple, you kind of have to understand, well, I just can't sit here and play video games by myself all day long, or I can't just go off and have my alone time anytime that I want because there's another person involved. And so balancing that independence with togetherness, right, is another area of compromise sometimes. And then here's a big one, sometimes a touchy one for families, is the extended family and social life, navigating your in-laws and your friendships. When you marry your spouse, some people say you also marry their friends, and that doesn't necessarily always have to hold true, right?
Yeah.
A lot. That's a big adjustment. I think that's a
is.
really big adjustment. So what we want to hear from our viewers, though, is which of these do you think is the most common area of compromise for couples? Is it A, life decisions, B, finances, money, C, parenting styles, which I think I've already said you want to hopefully figure that out before you get into the era in your life where you're bringing in children. How about personal time and couple time, which is D, or is it E, extended family and social life? Which of these 5 areas do you think is the most common area of compromise for a couple? Now, there's no right or wrong answer. We just want to take a survey of our wonderful viewers.
And again, we're not judging.
This is a judgment-free zone.
There you go, trick-free.
It's just us and the hundreds of thousands of our fellow viewers.
That's it.
So while our audience is kind of weighing in on this, Sister Cherise, which one of these do you think is the most common?
Oh, I feel like, the most common is for compromise, I feel like is daily life decisions. At least for me, in my marriage, I feel like it's daily life decisions is a compromise for us, trying to figure out, who's going to do what. But I feel like at the end of the day, the biggest thing with it is the communication. You have to have some type of communication with your partner, and then that way, there's an understanding of what's going to be done, and it's just not left to, well, I assume that you would take care of it. There should never be assumptions. because
We
that
all
that
know
always
how that happens, right?
know where that leads to. So yes, yeah, I always feel like, communicating with my husband always helps us. And then that way we can compromise in our daily life decisions. Who's going to do the chores? Who's, responsible for schedules and responsibilities as you see there. So that's at least for me. I don't know, Sister Joy, what do you think? What's the most common one for you?
For the most common one, I think it starts there with daily life. I have to agree with you. And I think you said a really important, factor here is communication.
Mhm.
Because if we can't communicate on a daily level on what those little things are, things like finances and parenting styles and, that personal time, and when it comes to extended family, I think that kind of snowballs, right? It kind of affects. So it's like those little things we have to be, and it's funny because when you get married, right, no matter how long, you said, Sister Sharice, right, you were together for how long before you
Mhm.
got married? It's a different ball game, y'all. When you get married, and you share the same walls together, it's completely different. Communication, you would think like, oh, but you live in the same house, you share the same, last name. It goes, the communication level is so much different. Like it's like they can't, of course, they can't read your mind, and making sure that we communicate in a way that
Wait, we can't?
you
Are we supposed to read your mind? I don't know.
I'm not a mind reader,
I've
right?
never.
So it's like, yeah, that communication level, like and it's like you got to work it out, right? You got to work it out with each other. It's like, oh, I can't just say this is what I want done, but or this is what we need to do. You really got to work it out, and you got to talk it in a way that you both can understand. And it's not just something that's one and done, right? It's a
Mhm.
constant thing that we have to constantly just be so proactive about and so intentional about, for sure. So I'm with you on that. I think daily life decisions, I'm on there. I think that's
You
one.
think daily life decisions? Yeah. I think I would agree because daily life decisions is kind of like it's kind of like the catch-all, right? Because
Yeah,
there's so many different things that can fall into that. Schedules for,
yeah.
who's dropping off the kids, who's picking up the kids, who's, the household chores, who's doing laundry. Well, that's easy. I'm doing the laundry. Who's
Good job, Lulu.
who's who's doing the dishes, who's doing the cooking. Well, and I'm not doing the cooking because I can't cook. So see, some of these decisions just come easy because from just from a practical sense. So we hope you guys have weighed in again. Let us know which one of these you think is the most common, which is either daily life decisions, A, B, finances, C, your parenting style, D, personal versus couple time, or E, extended family and social life. But let's talk a little bit about understanding what compromise really is, right?
Mhm.
Compromise is it about losing? No,
Oh, absolutely.
no, it's not about losing. It's about finding what we call mutual acceptable solutions. And that's a big fancy term, right? But that just basically means that in this instance, both parties in a couple, in a relationship, have to find something that's acceptable between both of them. That's truly what the definition of compromise is. It's not about losing. And there's a line, though, between what's known as healthy compromise, right, versus unhealthy sacrifice. And healthy compromise is
Yes.
when both of the parties, right, both parties are in a relationship and they give a little bit. So this way they can meet in the middle and then they can reach that mutually agreeable or acceptable solution we just talked about, right? Which means each party has to kind of give up a little bit. You can't be too rigid. That's what a healthy compromise is versus
Yeah, for
unhealthy
sure.
sacrifice, which is when there's always just one person who's giving up everything all the time. And Sister Joyna, we're talking about this right before the show, that we think this term unhealthy sacrifice is probably a little bit better description than the term that's thrown around so loosely today, right? What was that term we mentioned?
Toxic.
Toxic
Oh,
Yes.
relationships,
Oh, look,
right?
look at Sharice
yeah.
drawback. Yes, right?
Whoa.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, they
It
throw
is
that word
loosely
around like
said.
it's just so, and I think that it just misrepresents really what's happening, right? It just says toxic is just like it's just bad.
Mhm.
Um, but when you talk about an unhealthy sacrifice,
Mhm.
you're actually talking about what's happening in that relationship, which is that one person's always the one who's giving up their needs or their desires in order for the other person to win. And in that case, it is about losing because there's one person that's constantly losing. So you need to be able to recognize the differences between healthy compromise and unhealthy sacrifice.
Yeah.
Now, here's some misconceptions about compromising in a relationship, right? One is compromising means you always have to give up your needs, right? That shouldn't be the case. We just talked about that. Compromising is a sign of weakness. It's not, right? Compromise, in fact, is the opposite of that. If you can compromise, it's a sign of strength. It's a sign of strength of character because you're able to know what it is that you have to give up to be able to preserve that relationship. So it's definitely not a sign of weakness. And another misconception is that there's always got to be one person who is the one who has to compromise in that relationship. And when that happens, what that causes is something we call an imbalance.
It is
right?
imbalance for sure. Yeah.
It's an imbalance. It's an imbalance of power. It's an imbalance of how decisions are being made in that relationship. So I think that it's important we kind of talk about imbalance a little bit because that's really the root, right? It's the root of why these things exist or why they happen. So here's some of the roots of imbalance, and I think you guys probably will know a couple of these, right? Because they pop into your mind immediately. But like some of the roots of imbalance is differences in personality. When you're a new couple. Now, Sister Therese, you guys have been dating. How long did you guys date before you and Brother Eric got married?
5 years.
5 years. How about you, Sister Joy? You and Brother Billy?
I have to count. Okay, so
That long, huh?
it wasn't that long ago. How long ago was it? So it was 3 years.
3 years, 5 years. Okay, so 5 years, 3 years.
3 years.
And for Sister Lula, it was a couple of years, right? Which is somewhat average, but there's some people who the love at first sight syndrome where they get married like, oh, how long are you guys dating before you got married? 3 months.
Wow.
6 months or however long, or we had to wait 6 months because we just had to make sure we could get along and understand each other. And I'm like, 6 months is not a whole lot of time. But in part of that is because personality differences take time to develop and understand and learn how to understand one another. It's not something that just happens, right? So
unfortunately, no, it's not this, when you get married, right? You're like, oh, everything is so happily ever after. And you think everything's magical. No.
You're not going to know everything about your future spouse's personality that they've developed over the last 20, 25 years in 3 months. It's because a lot of the personality manifests itself later in the relationship, which takes time, right? That you don't start to see until afterwards. So understanding those personality differences is a key part of it. Now, the next is past experience and family dynamics. People who've grown up in different types of households also will have different values and principles, right? Now, of course, here in the Church of Christ, we all share the same values, which is the reason why it's so important, for us to obviously, when we are looking for a spouse and looking to develop relationships, those that share the same values in the church are the reason why it's most important. And we don't have to, worry about things that we know that wouldn't be proper or moral or within the core value structure, because within the church, we all share those same values. But that's one of the things that you also have to consider is like, what are the past experiences that people have, in their lives or their family dynamics? Maybe they grew up in a household where love and affection wasn't something that was always clearly demonstrated, right, amongst the children. Because in different households, you've got some households where the mom and the dad are like the huggy all the time, give me a kiss. Every time you hang up the phone, they say I love you. Like a conversation can't end without you saying it. And you have others where maybe that's not so evident, right? Because it's not the way the household is. So family dynamics play a huge part in imbalance because, again, getting to know your spouse it takes time. And learning what that family dynamic was for them takes time. There's societal expectations and gender roles. Now, we talked about this too before show, right? It's tough because there's preconceived notions about who takes on certain tasks or chores or responsibilities in the household based on gender roles and what society deems is the way that it should be. Now, of course, when it comes to cooking and cleaning and chores around the house, the in the more modern households, there's more of an equitable split in how that happens versus maybe back in the old days,
Mhm.
right? When it was the husband who did all of the work entirely, and then the wife did no work but just stayed at home. Well, did a lot of work but just
See,
stayed
I
at
was gonna
home,
say, wait
raised
a
the
minute, I'm gonna
children, and did.
defend those back then.
I'm going to
You're digging
rewind
a hole
that
now.
before the our audience blasts me on the. So when the wives did a tremendous amount of work managing the household, an incredible amount of work, and but today many of the households have both of the wife and the husband working, and the husband and the wife both care for the kids. They
Mhm.
take turns dropping the kids off to school, and maybe the other one picks the child up from school. Cooking and cleaning, and a lot of those household chores, doing laundry.
Yeah.
I'm going to keep bringing that up. You know, are things that now are kind of shared responsibility. So, but I think that imbalance comes from when you enter that relationship that maybe one spouse makes these assumptions that, well, that's not something I do.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I'm,
Exactly.
I'm the man of the
Which
house. I'm,
isn't
I'm not going to do that.
exactly, and which leads to that last one, right? To
Right.
communication. We said that earlier, right? You
Right.
really can't assume. You can't read the mind. So it's
No.
really, really important to, and then, there's going to be times where things change too. Like, okay, maybe naturally, the husband does the dishes, right? You do the dishes
Yeah.
all the time. There are going to be days that you don't feel like doing the dishes. Maybe something happened, right? And that's why, yeah, that communication is so important.
You know what? I think that's a great point, because that's an example of compromise right there. So let's say
So,
that was already kind of the defined division of labor, right?
Mm-hmm.
Joy, like one person cooks, and if I cook, the other person's got to do the dishes and clean the table, right? And that's the way that it's set up. But maybe there's something that the other person is supposed to cook, clean the dishes, wash the dishes, and clean the table. Maybe they're not feeling well, or maybe they've got responsibilities that may pull them away from that because they have to go and do that as opposed to. Now, the person who did the cooking now has to do the cleaning and putting away the dishes at the same time.
Mm-hmm.
And the world's not going to end, but it's called compromise, right? Because even though that wasn't their original agreement or arrangement, there had to be compromise because of that situation, that circumstance. And I think that that's just, really small example, obviously, of, when compromise sometimes has to occur. But this, in both you and Sister Sharice brought this up, that communication is key.
oh yeah, for
Being able to
sure.
communicate it, because if I know that I had something I had to do, I had a report to do, maybe I had to go do something at church or right afterwards. So I ate my fabulous meal that you cooked, and then I just took off
Mhm.
when I was supposed to be doing the dishes. Then the other person's like, "Well, what's going on?" And
Yeah.
then they feel like there's that imbalance, right? So I think that they need to obviously be able to be sure that they're properly communicating that. So another question for our audience. So which one of these do you think is the most common root for imbalance in compromise or in relationships? Is it differences in personality? Is it do you think it's the family dynamics? Is it the gender roles or expectations that maybe society has, which is H? Or is it I, a lack of communication? F, personality differences. G, past experiences and family dynamics. H, societal expectations, gender roles. Or I, a lack of communication.
Those are
Um,
really good.
I
Really, really.
think, honestly, this is all personal, right? To me personally, I think G, family dynamics, has a huge, huge influence, because how you're raised in your household is what dictates a lot of what your perception of the world is, right?
Yeah.
People who grow up in a household where it was very rigid, where mom was the one that did everything and then dad didn't do a lot of the
Great
household
point.
chores,
Great
kind of
point.
carries into your psyche when you enter into a relationship. And that's why I think it's important to communicate and
Yeah.
talk about it. But
Yeah.
so for me, I think it's family dynamics. What
I
do you
think
guys
that rings
think?
so true for me too, because that upbringing, and sometimes, when you're dating, when, before, I know that before we got married, everything is so nice. I mean, all the good things, and of course, maybe you'll know some of the bad things, but it's sometimes those past experiences and that, that family upbringing, it doesn't surface until you're really comfortable with each other.
Mhm.
And that does, like you said, it really does influence your relationship. So it's good to know. I think that it's good to know that that could be one of the roots. And then again, communication, right? Making sure you're always open and communicating with each other so that you work those things out. And that's the beauty of marriage. That's a beauty of marriage. And it's always communicating, because all those things are always going to be different. It's kind of boring if you married someone who's just like you, like,
Oh yeah,
right?
no, I'm definitely not like Sister
Sorry.
Lulu. I'm definitely not like my wife.
Definitely. Hmm.
What about you, Sister Shoes? What do you think is the most common root for
I feel
imbalance?
like, well, you already know what my standpoint is communication, but I also
Um,
want to identify the personality differences as well, because I feel like that can be a huge factor into your imbalance, like if you have one who's I think we said it so perfectly, like one who's always willing to compromise, but then you have another one who's willing to take advantage of that. I feel like those personality differences can also coincide with one another, especially because if you look at all of these together, it's also perfectly to represent why there's a whole imbalance, because
Yes.
gender roles, or like you said earlier, Brother Robert, family dynamics, your experiences with how you saw your parents' marriage growing up, or your
mhm.
grandparents' marriage growing up. So then you're like, okay, well, that's what my marriage is going to be like. And then you have the society, now we're in a society where I feel like it's more open communication is celebrated. I feel like within our society now, because now you see like, oh, okay, well, my partner expects me to do this, or my partner wants me to do this, but I'm going to do it because I want my partner to feel respected. I want my partner to feel like this marriage and our partnership means something to me, because in the end it's all about that long-term happiness, your emotional well-being. If your partner's not happy, you're not going to be happy, because all of that's kind of just going to cascade down into how your marriage is. So I feel like all of those fit perfectly. But again, it always comes down to that communication. I feel like if you can't communicate with your partner, like, this is how I'm feeling right now, I feel like I've compromised all of this, I need you to meet me halfway, which is what we saw in the earlier slide. I feel like we hear that all the time: meet me halfway. And I feel like if your partner is more than willing and respects you enough and loves you enough, then they'll realize, okay, I need to pick up some slack here and there. Especially for me as a mother. I don't know about you, Sister Joy. Sometimes it gets overwhelming, and I'm like, please meet me halfway. And
100%. Yes.
meet me halfway.
So
So
Like, don't even meet
what
me
do you
halfway. Just hold my hand.
there's so much happening.
I feel a little bit seen here. I'll admit. Okay, I feel a little bit seen. So, but and I've heard communication. I think even in the chat, that's kind of blowing up as one of the overwhelming causes for, or most common causes for roots of imbalance. And why do you think the communication is so difficult, or is it more difficult for one spouse versus the other? Like,
Ooh.
for example, my fellow husbands. Do you think just in general, husbands have a harder time communicating their feelings than spouses?
I
Remember,
think
safe
we need
zone.
a show on this one, just a separate show, because this I think I can talk about all day long. I think there's a secret language men have in communicating. I mean, for those of you who know my husband too, he's very straightforward, and he will tell you as it is, right?
Mhm.
Me, on the other hand, I'm a little bit more elaborate. I like adjectives. I like, my name is an emotion, y'all. I'm joy.
Joy.
So
Yes.
I,
Let's have a joyful conversation here.
Mhm.
so I am full of emotion, like literally.
Mhm.
And so you combine those things, and like you said, Sharice, the personality differences. I mean, but communication is definitely key. But I think husbands communicate. I'm going off a little bit, but yeah, I think communication. I think husbands communicate just a little bit differently than women do.
Right. But I also feel like it's probably because of where they were, like what did they pick on growing up? How did
Mhm.
their lack of communication, if that's what we're going to say. How did that come to be, you know? And I feel like the beauty of it in finding, you know, like in being a partner is saying, okay, there's something lacking that I'm not giving into this relationship. Is it communication? I need to work on that. And then being able to work, because it's like for me, sometimes I approach my family dynamic or my relationship as like a what is the when you're working and you have like that yearly eval. Okay, let's have an evaluation of our relationship right now. This is
Are you talking about doing performance evaluations on one another?
for
Are
me.
you, is there like a grade? Am I going to be like meeting expectations, exceeding expectations, or are there opportunities for improvement? Because that's where I feel this is
Exactly what
going.
I'm thinking. Like, are there key performance indicators here that you're? Let me score you here.
For you a little bit on where you're lacking, needs improvement in certain areas. But yeah, I feel like, but that's all, you know, communicating with one another. But yeah, that is, I feel like there's always something in you that you need to work on, you know, to be able to have that balance in your marriage together, right? I mean, that's the whole beauty of it, is communicating. And if you can't communicate openly with your spouse, if you feel like if you're going to say something but it's not recepted enough, you know, like in a way that you'd want, sometimes ultimately that can build resentment and you can feel shut down. And then that's what really, really leads to that imbalance and can lead to that unhealthy marriage, I guess, right? Is that what I like, that term, unhealthy? We're not going to use that T word anymore. I love
Yeah, we're
that
not
word.
going to use the T word. The T word's no longer in there. But when you specifically talking about like lack of communication, I just think that when we, because I'm the one who opened up the can of worms about, do you think that men have a more difficult time communicating than women, because we just either feel like we don't know how to communicate things because maybe we're afraid that we're going to say things that are going to trigger emotions. We're dare I use the word, say, walking on eggshells, because we're afraid that we don't want to create any kind of conflict, right?
Well, look how you're being careful now.
No, but seriously, I think it's because and this is what leads to a lack of communication. And communicating openly is an art form. I mean, you're right. We can have a whole conversation about this, because I think you have to practice communicating, and then understanding that communicating is okay, and talking about things is okay. Trying to manage emotions and feelings when you're communicating is an important aspect of that, because then depending on how people perceive that reaction to it, it may cause them to want to communicate less, because they're feeling like, well, if I do say that, or if I do try to communicate my feelings, it's going to be met with something. And I talk to a lot of friends that when they do struggle with it, that becomes the root cause. Like, yeah, I do have things I want to say, things I want to get off my chest, but I can't, because I just want to end the conversation. I just want to end, I just want to go on. But that in reality isn't healthy either, right? So that's something that we're going to talk about here in a second, because, and Sister Cherise kind of led to it. And what are some of the consequences of imbalance? I think she was reading ahead. I think she was reading ahead. The words you were throwing out there, when we talk about the consequences of imbalance, you've got resentment gets developed, right? Because if there's constantly, one person in the relationship who is giving in, and there's constantly one person in the relationship who's always having to be the one to compromise, it's going to lead to resentment and bitterness. And then this is kind of an escalating ladder, right? This is because resentment and bitterness lead to what we just talked about, which is a breakdown in communication, because then the person doesn't feel valued. They don't feel like, well, what's the point? What's the point in talking about it? Because I always end up compromising. I always end up giving in. So there's no need for me to communicate anything anymore. I'm just going to go ahead and give in. And then eventually, which is the worst part of it, is that a breakdown in communication eventually leads to just emotional distancing. Emotional distancing is probably the worst that can happen, because then that just leads to just people just not wanting to even not only not talk, but not even care anymore. Right.
Sure.
And that's
or even like those suppressed feelings. If you just kind of suppress it, I mean, there's a higher chance for that stuff to come back up again. And then you're in that vicious cycle again where you're you're resenting everything and you're bitter about everything. And then you suppress it. And then it just a vicious cycle.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, and I think it's important that we try to understand clearly when people are trying to communicate things, that ability to take and listen. And I think this is probably one of the things we're going to talk about here in just a second. But being able to listen, just truly listen,
Yeah.
and not judge, not react, not these are all things that I think are helpful in being able to foster better communication, because if a lack of communication is the root to imbalance, then maybe that's the first step, right? You've got to work on being able to build that communication.
Yeah.
So when we talk about what are some of the things that are important in compromise, right? So why is compromising so important in a relationship? One is it builds mutual respect. A healthy relationship is obviously founded on mutual respect between both the husband and the wife, because there can't just be one person who is just in charge. It's a mutual relationship. That's why it's called a relationship, right? And there's an even more important word down here at the bottom bullet that we're going to talk about in a second that I know Sister Sharice brought up earlier too. But it also is essential because it demonstrates love and commitment. You entered into a marriage because you love that person. And if you love that person, that means that you're willing to see them as happy as you want to be, right? That's what compromise is. You want them to be just as happy as you are. And their happiness has to be a priority for you. I think that's one thing that we need to do.
I kind of like how that's also a little plug for you, right?
For next week's program, next week. Well, we don't have commercials on INCRadio Florida, so we just got to throw the commercials in. So it's about demonstrating love. It obviously reduces conflict, right? If you can communicate openly and get the other person in the relationship to understand what's happening and why you're feeling the way that you're feeling and why it's important to you that this certain decision go this way, it's going to help to reduce a lot of that tension. And then lastly, it creates a sense of partnership. That's what a relationship is, right? A relationship is not a dictatorship. Relationship is a partnership. And you want to be able to be sure that both parties feel like they're contributing and that both parties have the privilege of being able to be happy in that relationship. So I think these are the reasons why creating and pursuing compromise is such an important aspect in a relationship. It's foundational, right? And the earlier you do it in the relationship, then the less the struggle will be further down, because the time to compromise, the time to learn how to compromise doesn't happen when you've been together for 25 years at that point. Because at that point, and you've already sort of chipped away. Because I talk about, like, every time, in a relationship, anything damaging happens, I equate it to a relationship as being this boulder, this rock, this mountain, right? Solid foundation. And then every time something happens in that relationship that damages it, it's like somebody took a chisel and just chipped away at it, right?
Mm-hmm.
And just imagine, so this massive boulder foundation of marriage is being chipped away year after year after year after year for whatever reasons, right? Because of compromise, resentment, all of these things that occur, that eventually you've chipped away so much that it's going to be so much more difficult to rebuild it and patch it, right? So it's easier to start earlier in the relationship to be able to manage that.
And then keep up with it, right?
Yeah.
Definitely keep up with it.
Maintaining it, it's just like with everything, right? So of course, not everything is doomsday. There are ways to get there, right? There are some strategies for being able to compromise and create healthy compromise. And this is what we talked about earlier, right? But one of the first strategies is, first of all, being able to listen. I mean, truly, truly listen and be empathetic. Empathetic means that you can actually put yourself in the shoes of your partner and understand what their perspective is. So,
Brother Billy says something about listening. He's like, that listen and silent have the same letters. I don't know if he's just saying that to me, but listen The
Oh
words
my goodness, they
and
do.
silent, right?
I just jumbled them in my head. So
Right?
listening and say, oh wow, okay. See, your husband obviously is a very good listener. So Brother Billy, shout out to you. Well, and active listening means not
Mhm.
staring at your phone,
Yes.
Oh,
right?
yes.
Not the person's trying to share their feelings with you, and you're like, oh yeah, yeah, got it. Okay, sure, and then
Yes.
you're staring at your phone while you're listening is not active listening. Active listening is making eye contact with them. It's actually letting them know that you are processing what it is that they're saying, because um, otherwise they're going to feel like, what's the point of me sharing this with you if you're not listening to me? So they need to have your full attention. So active listening, be empathetic. Those are, really goals in helping to understand your partner's perspective. Communicating your needs clearly, expressing what truly matters. That's a hard thing. I think we talked about that a couple of slides back when I was opening a can of worms about men communicating, because I really think it's just a thing. And I don't want to say it's a gender thing, but I think that just men have a more difficult time in not, saying all men do, but I said just generally men have a more difficult time expressing their feelings and expressing what their needs are. And I think it's something that just takes a little bit of work. But communicating clearly what your needs are is
Yeah.
important, because we don't expect people to be mind readers, right?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Can we? Can I put a slide up that just says we don't expect people to be mind readers? Would that be too much? Because
It might be just a little bit, just a little bit.
there's expectations, right? There's expectation that if you've been with someone for so long that you should know. There's things that you should quote know already, right? But if it's not something you've ever experienced, not something you've ever been communicated about,
Mhm.
then you can't read your mind. So being able to often communicate, I think, is important.
You know what? That
Um,
that now makes me think, communicating is more than words,
mhm.
right? So if someone is not saying anything and they're just a little off, I mean, we can communicate with like
Silence.
silence, yes. Silence is definitely a one way of communicating, right?
Silence is the great communicator. It's the minute that when you walk into the room and it's just dead silence, and then
Then
you
you
know to
in
turn
the
around and
danger
walk out,
zone.
right?
You know that's the danger zone, right?
Yeah? Turn
Women
around
are
and
good at
walk
that,
back
I
out.
think.
Yeah, I mean it's true. Communicating your needs, and we're not advocating that that's how you should communicate. Silent communication is not the answer. It's it's actually expressing verbally what it is that you think is important to you, because that's the only way that your partner, your spouse, is going to know that.
Yes, exactly.
And the power of win-win, Sister Sharice, I know this is a big thing, right? Being able to have a win-win situation where it's not win-lose, which is what
Mhm.
happens in an unhealthy sacrifice relationship, and finding that middle ground without resentment. We talked about this before, I think, on a previous show, that for me, resentment and regret are two very wasteful emotions, right?
Yes.
Because
Yes,
they don't lead to anything, right?
they don't.
Some people will argue that, well, regret leads to learning, right? Because you learned, but you can learn, but you don't have to live and dwell and regret decisions
Yeah,
that you made, because regret's not going to change it, right? The
exactly.
outcome is the outcome,
Yeah,
and you learn from it and you move on. But I think that resentment is right up there with it, right? Because it's
absolutely.
again, it's an emotion that's very difficult to try and get past,
Mhm.
especially when you're trying to then effectively communicate, because as long as that continues to persist. But we also have to recognize, again, from slide number one, about different personalities, and that we have people in relationships that have different personalities, so we just all have to try to do our best to come to that compromise, right?
Yeah.
And when you come to an impasse, when you, as members of the Church of Christ, when we come to an impasse in any conflict, the first thing we do is we pray. We get together as a couple, and just set aside everything else that you're talking about, and you pray, because at that point, that's what brings you peace to be able to then continue the conversation.
And that's
Because
when it's so nice and it's beautiful to see that, because no matter what kind of speed bump you run into as a couple, when you pray together, you're
Mhm.
bringing that, you're kind of opening the lines to communication together to our Almighty God. So it's just a
Right.
beautiful thing to experience in your marriage, and it's something that should oh that's definitely a prescription right
Yeah.
there
That's a
that will help the
that's
communication.
well, what it does is that's very well put. It opens the door for communicating, because then at that point you're asking God to do exactly that, and that's what you should include in the prayer, is that you'll be able to express openly what it is that you need to discuss. So this way you can have a very, very frank, very open, and very meaningful conversation with each other to be able to talk about what's important. And then this the fourth bullet, I think Sister Joy and I were kind of like struggling to come up with examples, like, knowing when to stand firm versus when to bend, right? Prioritizing what's truly important. And like we stated earlier, being members of the church, we all share the same values, right?
Mhm.
Our values have been taught to us over the years. So we understand the values that are important to us as members of the church, but there are certain things. And so the only example I could come up with, and I really hope she's not watching, but the one example I could come up with is, for example, here's how you know when to stand firm. I know that I will never be able to take my wonderful wife camping. That's just not going to happen. Okay, it's not going to happen.
You can't take her camping, but how about glamping?
I can glamping, right? So I want to go to the redwoods. I want to go see those beautiful tall trees and be out in the woods. I'm just going to have to do it in the comfort of a Marriott hotel. So, but that's called compromise,
There
right?
you
So
go.
I mean, literally the only example that I could come up with in terms of understanding where you, as a spouse and in a relationship, you have to learn at what point that's as far as I'm going to go. It's not going to go any further. So, that's the closest example that I could think of.
I
And if you
think
guys,
that is a great example of
yeah,
compromise on both ends.
on
You
both
still
ends, right? Got to go see the
do.
redwoods, but we're going to do it from the comfort of a hotel with air conditioning and what is it, 800 knit comforters or whatever. How do they
You
classify
can still
them?
bring your stove if you want, and
Yeah,
for a hike, right?
yeah, I'll go sit out in the parking lot and have my coffee. So, but that's an important part, is that you've got to know what things you can't compromise on, right? In any decision, it's whether it's going on vacations or deciding where you're going to spend money on, or the big decisions like buying a house. What are some things in the house that you have to have, right? So, or that need to exist. Each person, husband and wife, going into a home buying purchase, probably have, like, it needs to have a place for me to have an office, or it needs to have a place for me to have my man cave, or I need to have a place to do my crafts or whatever. It has to be 2-story, it has to be 1-story. There are things that you have to define. And then being able to handle, and this is actually an entire show we're going to be doing, is conflict resolution techniques, because that's not going to happen in 11 minutes.
No, for sure.
But it's understanding how to manage conflict resolution, because it's inevitable.
Mhm.
There is no relationship that I can imagine doesn't have conflict at some level,
And that would be
right?
boring,
Yeah, it would be boring. Yeah, it
right?
would.
Like it's just like that blows my mind to even think about. It's not that I like conflict, what? Not at all, but it just adds after you overcome, a difficulty or a conflict together. There's strength that comes from that in your relationship and your partnership, right? And it's
Yeah,
just, yeah, that would be so boring.
I think that's 100%, because when you talk about coming out of a conflict or coming out of a situation where you guys have had to compromise and gone through the whole exercise of compromising, you're going to come out stronger,
Oh
because
yeah.
you've learned about each other, right? You've
Mhm.
learned something more about one another. You've learned about what's important to that person, hopefully, because that's the whole point. You want to understand what's important for them. And
Mhm.
then you're hopefully, and this is where sometimes husbands fail, you remember it for the next time.
I'm happy you said that, Robert. Yes.
Yeah, I am taking one for the team, for all husbands that are out there. So
You know,
But
they all appreciate that.
just know sometimes we will forget. It doesn't mean we don't love you. Doesn't mean that we don't care. It just we have sometimes we're just simple.
Oh no.
and we forget. But it's important that you continuously learn from that. So, and I know I've been watching Sister Charisse. Our chat's been kind of blowing up. I know with comments and stuff from our audience. I'd like to take just a couple minutes to if you wouldn't mind, kind of going over some of the comments that we're getting on some of the topics and some of the questions that we asked earlier. You got them there?
Your sister Annalisa, she had a good one. She said, "I think wives have a harder time expressing what they need." She said, "We beat around the bush, and especially our husbands to know what we want. Oh, maybe expect our husbands to know what we want. But husbands are straightforward and will just say what they need." Yeah, I can definitely see and understand that as well. Yes. Um,
I don't know. I'm kind of a beat around the bush kind of guy. If you ask Sister Lulu, she'll tell you. I think that's probably one area I need to work on sometimes because I'm I've been accused sometimes of being too political with how I approach things because I'm very careful about people's feelings and emotions, and then it'll. There's an old saying that it took me 20 minutes to take something a route that only took 5. Kind
You
of
know what?
like me
That's a
trying to
good point.
explain this right now, right?
That's a good point. I think there's always one of the I mean, you always have those two. So whether it's like the wives are usually like that or it's the husband, sometimes it's reverse, right? Or sometimes maybe your partner is the one, like the woman could be very straightforward and say, just
Yeah.
say it,
But
right?
I prefer honestly though. Sometimes I prefer. No, not sometimes. I think we always prefer. If there's something you want, tell us.
Hmm.
Tell us because if you don't, I can't read your mind. I think
yes,
we've already established that. So
right.
just tell us.
But I
And
also feel too. I think what you just said. If you want something, just tell us, right, Brother Rob? But I feel like
mhm.
also what we have to remember as wives, it's the way we tell what we need. There's a difference between calmly and effectively and saying, "Honey, this is what I need," versus escalating it to because
Yeah.
you've let it build up all that resentment, right? All that everything's building up, and now it becomes you're so upset, and now you're yelling, trying to. Well, I told you what I wanted and needed, but
Hmm.
it's the delivery, right?
Yeah.
Say it.
Well, but yelling and escalating a conversation, I think, comes from a lack of feeling like you've been heard,
Yeah.
right?
Mhm.
Because either you're saying what you're saying, but the person that you're saying it to doesn't hear it, or you don't think that they're hearing it, because there's a difference between listening and hearing, right?
Hmm. Yeah. Oh, yeah.
And so you feel like the way to get that across is because you really want to drive your point home. But then it gets to the point where then emotions take over. And then when emotions take over, then it's no longer about you wanting to be heard for what you're saying. You just want to be heard.
Yeah.
And it
Good
it
point.
it's that's why it's so difficult to sometimes pull back from that. And that's like what we just talked about. That's when you stop, you pray, and you pray for peace. You pray that you'll be in a state where you'll be able to communicate calmly, openly, very important, and then and not have to, because sometimes you just got to kind of pull back and de-escalate
Oh, yeah.
the situation, and which is a really important component as well.
Yeah.
Let me see. I think we had some other comments that were in there, Sister Charisse, too. I just was scrolling when I looked and I said, "Ooh, the comment chat thing just kind of exploded." So
A lot.
Oh, yeah. It's pretty active on here.
There are.
great. I mean, we love hearing from all of you guys because this program is really designed to try to share not just the ideas that obviously that we've come up with, but we want these experiences to be things that truly relate to situations and that can obviously be of value to everything that you guys are experiencing. And I know that in the chats there are lots and lots of opportunity for you to be able to compromise. I know that scrolling through here to try to find one, but I'm glad to see that my wife is willing to go to Yellowstone. So
Mhm.
thank you for that. And we'll stay at a 5-star tent while we're there.
Oh,
Well,
there's
we're there.
everybody agrees about the communication, seems like, on the chat. And then even Brother Real said good family dynamics can be achieved through communication. And that's very, very true. I feel like you said, good family dynamics. I even brought that up with Brother Eric, and I feel like that would be a perfect topic for, a future episode. I told him one day, because he was like, he's like, I feel like most of our communication problems, hon, always stem from I'm telling the kids to do something and they don't listen. They're not listening. They're old enough to listen. And I said, well, you know what, hon? I said, I agree with you. I said, why don't we just approach it then? Let's have a huddle. Let's have a huddle with our kids, and just say, listen, this is what we need you to do this week. This is how you help mommy and daddy, stuff like that. And I feel like that communication is what leads to the good family dynamics. So I feel like that all coincides with one another. Knowing how to talk to your kids, and then maybe setting up that foundation, early on, a build communication, because what did it in the previous slides, the root of imbalance might have been because of how you grew up in your childhood, what you were exposed to. So maybe exposing our kids early on, being able to communicate effectively and openly, will hopefully lead to them not having, imbalances in their future relationships with their
That is such a great insight, because we talk about this all the time. When you look at different families, like there's some families where the kids don't ever talk to the parents, and the parents like just always wonder, like, what's my kid doing? What's my kid up to? What are they thinking? What's bothering them? And you have other relationships. And Sister Lulu and I actually seem to feel like we're pretty blessed that our kids are pretty open with us, sometimes more open than we want them to be, but they are pretty. I'm not going into any specifics, but they talk about things that bother them, things that they're concerned about, and not. And this is going to be a conversation we're going to have too about. We're there to be open for them and to listen and to be friends, but that's not the only relationship. We're not. Parents aren't. The goal of a parent is not to be your kid's friend.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's not the goal. The goal is to be able to be friendly enough with them that they'd be willing to trust you and be open in conversation. But our job as parents is to be parents, and that provides guidance and all of the other things that go with it. But I think that's a great topic as well. Is about fostering that open communication with your children, so that way they'll communicate with you. Because just as you said, that then eventually leads to them being able to communicate in their relationships with their families and their spouse, further down. So that's, I think that would be an awesome dynamic to start developing for them as well. Well, we used to say that this was the fastest 30 minutes on radio, but we can't say that really anymore, right? Because we're on for more than 30 minutes, but still, 58 minutes flew by a lot quicker than we'd anticipated. And we're really grateful to all of you that tuned in today. This was a great topic. I think, we got a lot of feedback in the chat. I think, but, one of the big secrets, though, that I've got to share, it seems like, in the art of compromise, that I thought was very, very insightful, came from one of our wonderful viewers there. Brother Ryan DeSena says that he's noticed that Sister Annalisa finds it much easier to compromise when she is presented with food. That's
same.
And I'm going to leave that at that. So, but let's, of course, we want to thank everyone who had helped us in being able to put this program on today, of course, and that begins with our beloved Executive Minister, Brother Eduardo Vimanalo. Thank you both for always supporting us globally with all of the projects of the church, of course, and our CEBSI CEO and CFO coordinator, Brother Angelo Eranio Manalo, Brother Manly Andaya, who's our executive producer, and of course, to our station manager, Brother Wally Taray. We thank you all for helping and supporting this show called INC Radio Florida. Next week, we're going to be doing a program on social media etiquette. Is your behavior on social media cringy, or is it cool? I don't know. We're going to find that out. I could tell you my opinion of mine, or other people's opinion of my social media behavior, but we're going to discover all of that next week. But we want to thank Sister Joy, of course, for joining us today in Orlando, Sister Charisse there in Pensacola, for all of your insightful input on today's show. We hope that you guys all learned a few things. you learned that I am going to go camping eventually. But we want to thank everyone who was able to chime in the chat, because we think we truly value all of that input. But please stay tuned. INC Radio Washington, D.C. is coming up next. But we want to, of course, thank everyone for joining us today. And we will see you next week on INC Radio Florida.
This is INC Radio, DCEM 954, the voice of truth, the official radio station of the Church of Christ or Iglesia ni Cristo.